Hello, this is Andy Kolesar, partner in Thompson Hine's Environmental Practice Group, welcoming you to our L.A.W.S podcast. L.A.W.S stands for Land, Air, Water, and Safety. And today we will be focusing on the land and water aspects of environmental law with our guest, John Simon, who's a principal at Gnarus Advisors, LLC, working in Washington, D.C. John is an environmental consultant with over 3 decades of experience in assessing and remediating hazardous substances and petroleum. John's areas of expertise include remediation, fate and transport, timing of releases, environmental insurance, and liability risk transfer, as well as due diligence and environmental management. John is well known in the remediation field. He's been on the editorial advisory board of the Remediation Journal since 1991, and the journal's editor-in-chief since 1999. John and I have worked together for many years on remediation projects across the country, and I have relied on John's expertise and advice on numerous remediation and environmental litigation topics over the years. John, welcome to the podcast.
Well, Andy, thank you for having me.
John will share with us today some insights he has regarding per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, otherwise known as PFAS, or the forever chemicals because of their persistence in the environment. John's deeply involved in PFAS regulatory and remediation developments. Among other things, John founded and led the PFAS Experts Symposium, which was attended by over 60 PFAS experts in 2019 and 2021. And he's a frequent speaker on PFAS and other emerging contaminant issues. We trust that our listeners are at least somewhat familiar with PFAS, so we're going to focus today on some of the hot topics of key interest to the regulated community, including EPA's proposal to list PFAS as a hazardous substance, interim and final health advisories, due diligence considerations, and remediation considerations. John, before we hit those topics, and I said we're not going to go into all the background about PFAS, but what's the big deal anyway?
The big deal is the toxicity related to PFAS and the US EPA and states' stringent regulatory approaches and very stringent cleanup levels, orders of magnitude below what we typically see with other common contaminants like chlorinated solvents, which makes it quite difficult to clean up in the environment. Now, in addition, PFAS, as these forever chemicals, have been getting really frequent notice in the media. And most people actually know what forever chemicals are. I was in a social event not too long ago, and it actually was the topic of the event. It was quite interesting. So people are concerned, namely because they recognize that PFAS are ubiquitous and are present throughout the environment, and they are really, unfortunately, in everybody's blood, which makes people hypersensitive to the potential health effects of PFAS.
Sure. And therefore the governments, the federal government and the state governments are responding accordingly because of this interest. John, the first topic that we wanted to hit today is the proposed listing of a couple of the PFAS compounds as hazardous substances. On September 6th of this year, EPA released a proposed rule to designate 2 of the compounds as hazardous substances. As expected, they've received a lot of comments. I know we were anticipating that the final rule would come out maybe in the summer of 2023. I understand now that some industry groups are going to be challenging that rule, and we'll have to see how that plays out. Um, in my view, it's just a matter of time before EPA finalizes the rule or Congress does it for them. So let's talk about what this is going to mean in the context of Superfund, for example.
Okay. So it affects Superfund in a couple different ways. One, when there's releases of the two PFAS, one of the two PFAS above a reportable quantity, it would need to be reported to the National Response Center. The two compounds are, I'll just use the abbreviation PFOA and PFOS. Um, and in addition, um, the EPA could list sites based on the presence of PFAS. And when I say PFAS in the context of Superfund, I'm referring to PFOA and PFOS. And in addition, this hazardous substance designation could complicate existing CERCLA or Superfund removal actions or remedial actions, site cleanups, because they've been testing for the primary contaminants of concern, and now PFAS is going to be added if they're suspected, if it's detected. It could trigger a whole different regulatory approach to the cleanups. And what we are seeing is EPA is currently requiring PFAS testing, particularly in groundwater, as part of the 5-year reviews. And so PFAS is detected. I'm familiar with a landfill. 5-year review came around. They detected PFAS. It was far reaching, and it wasn't being treated by the existing pump and treat system. So the regulatory agency required the responsible parties very quickly to put on additional treatment, and it was even affecting homes in the area. So it was very interesting. I mean, a very profound impact due to one little requirement to do 5-year the testing as part of the 5-year reviews.
And
Yeah.
that situation that you're talking about even has happened before the identification of those two compounds as hazardous substances.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. The EPA has the authority to require testing, and it was deemed an imminent and substantial endangerment, and so they used that requirement under Superfund to trigger the additional work. And then one other thing that is complicated but could be far-reaching is there's a number of Superfund sites with ongoing allocation proceedings, meaning that the parties are trying to determine what the equitable and fair shares for each party are based on their contribution to the cleanup. And a detection of PFAS could turn that allocation proceeding on its head, because let's assume that you have a site that's driven by trichloroethylene or TCE, and then all of a sudden PFAS is detected. It could change the cleanup approach, require more expense, and all of a sudden a chlorinated solvent party might have a smaller share than a PFAS party. Whereas before PFAS were being tested, the shares were being divided in a different way based on the cost causation of each responsible party's input of contaminants into the site. So we're adding a new contaminant with very stringent cleanup levels, potentially, depending on what state we're in, that could really change these allocation proceedings.
Is there? I'm sorry. I was going to say, is there in those types of sites where you may have PFAS as well as other more typical contaminants of concern, is there will there be an overlap between the remediation of the PFAS versus the other contaminants, or is it sort of a separate remediation technologies?
Um, it's site specific, but in general terms, there will be some overlap. Um, Assuming that, it's not metals and PFAS, because then there might not be overlap. But if it's an organic compound like trichloroethylene that migrates at about the same rate as many PFAS compounds. Um, there might be some overlap, but it will change in some way how the remedy is performed. Because, for example, if you're using activated carbon, PFAS is going to break through and use more carbon than TCE. And you can, or TCE could be degraded in situ, whereas PFAS, at least right now, based on existing technologies, can't be remediated in situ.
Are there other regulatory programs that may be affected by the listing as hazardous substances?
Um, it will, well, one, the RECRA cleanup program is actually looking at listing PFAS as a appendix 8 or 9 constituent, which will lead to its listing as a hazardous waste. The toxic release inventory has requirements, which is under, falls under CERCLA. So it will affect other regulatory programs in addition to just cleanups.
Maybe DOT regulation as well as a hazardous material.
Yeah, it could be, absolutely, the transportation.
Okay, well, I wanted to move on to our second topic, which is the interim and final health advisories. Um, I will note that EPA recently lowered the drinking water health advisory levels for PFOA and PFOS to some ungodly low concentrations. Um, so, John, first, what are health advisories? How do they differ from MCLs and MCLGs? And what's the impact of this lowered health advisory for these two PFAS compounds?
Okay. Well, health advisories are levels established by the EPA to protect all people, including sensitive populations, and various ages, from adverse health effects resulting from exposure to chemicals, and now including PFAS. And so they're calculated to offer a margin of protection. Uh, and it's interesting, um, the the PFOA and the PFOS health advisories are based on the suppression of vaccination to 5 to 7 year olds. It's a study that was done in the Faroe Islands, um, due to exposure to PFOA and PFOS. So, in other words, it's not that the vaccines won't work; it's that the body's immune response to the vaccine is suppressed by the exposure to PFOA and PFOS. And that's based on studies. There's an association between the exposure and the supposed suppression, at very low concentrations. So we ended up with these extremely low health advisories of four, well, 0.4 parts per quadrillion for PFOA and 20 parts per quadrillion for PFOS. So it well below the detection limits for any or any really, even the most sensitive analytical methods.
And then what happens next with these health advisories?
Um, so the health advisories, there's a couple things that could happen. One, the first time the EPA set health advisories, it was at 70 parts per trillion, as opposed to parts per quadrillion. So much, much 1,000 times higher. Uh, and a number of states latched onto those and used those as drinking water or groundwater cleanup guidance. Um, so some states may use the health advisories in establishing guidance. I don't think it would be at these extremely low levels that we're seeing, but it could drive the levels down. Another thing is that they're typically used in the MCL, the maximum contaminant level setting process, and the MCL contaminant level goals. And often health advisories become the MCLGs, the goals. Um, but not necessarily the MCLs, which will have some level of economics or at least detection limits incorporated within them. At least that's what I've heard.
And those of us who have been following these developments, as you alluded to, know that states have been issuing either drinking water standards or groundwater cleanup standards that get lower and lower. Um, and that must be creating some real concern for companies that are being required to remediate these substances.
Yes, because you get to a point where it's technically impracticable to reach some of the levels. And I was at a conference last week, and I heard that it's EPA, which is supposed to be setting proposed drinking water standards for PFOA and PFAS before the end of the year, that the level could be 4 parts per trillion, which is EPA's accepted detection limit for these two compounds.
And then would you expect US EPA to adopt that as obviously as a groundwater standard if anyone's drinking the groundwater?
Yeah, it'll become an ARAR or the basis of remediation goals at Superfund sites more likely than not. And it could be 4 parts per trillion at some Superfund sites. And as well, states with stringent levels could go even lower.
So you and I both have played a role in due diligence over the years for our clients, sometimes working together. And this is obviously starting to get the attention of all of us who assist companies with due diligence in corporate and real estate transactions. Um, we have generally relied on agency no further action approvals and other certificates of completion and such things to provide comfort that a historical issue or recognized environmental condition has been adequately addressed. What do you think about that reliance in the context of these PFAS developments?
I think it will be important to look at the underlying basis of those no further action determinations and the historical operations of facilities to assess whether PFAS could be present, because even with a no further action, the presence of PFAS could still pose a liability to the property.
What types of facilities might you expect to have PFAS concerns?
I mean, the two obvious ones are facilities that either manufactured PFAS or use PFAS in the process. And then as well, fire training or fire response sites that used aqueous film forming foams or AFFF in the process. So a fire training area that repeatedly had foam sprayed on it is quite likely to have a PFAS issue. Then in addition, there's various industrial sites that may have used PFAS as either an ingredient or it was even unknowingly present in a product. And then landfills, which are rarely part of due diligence, but they're important to look at, if somebody's buying a landfill, of course, but the proximity to a landfill site, as well as wastewater treatment plants. And in particular, with respect to wastewater treatment, is the application of biosolids, which can accumulate PFAS. And then biosolids are often used as fertilizers on agricultural properties. And I've actually experienced a couple of different times the presence of PFAS contamination due to the spreading of biosolids. And I mean, we're talking about spreading across 3 counties and 50 different farms.
when we were talking about the potential listing of PFAS compounds as hazardous substances, we did not mention what impact that will have on ASTM Phase 1 environmental site assessments. Um, Maybe you could talk a little bit about ASTM 21 and what and how ASTM is dealing with PFAS at this point.
So my understanding is that the ASTM E1527 standard that was released in 2021 treats PFAS as a out of scope work item, but it's still a critical element because if an environmental professional overlooks PFAS, it could create liability for their company and obviously their client as well. And I wouldn't be surprised if ASTM incorporates PFAS into the ASTM standard, not in the near future because the process is a long process to get through because it's a consensus-based undertaking. But it might not wait 5 years like they typically do to issue a new ASTM real estate-based standard, or basically an updated version of E1527, the Phase 1 standard.
Now, if PFAS becomes a hazardous substance, then that will automatically be covered under ASTM, correct?
Absolutely correct, Andy. That's an excellent point.
So, what's your advice to companies and lawyers who you're working with about evaluating the PFAS risks in the context of due diligence?
When retaining an environmental consultant, I would uh, I would suggest or recommend including PFAS as part of the scope of work. So a review of PFAS and PFAS substances and sources, as well as I'd make sure the environmental professional who's doing the work is cognizant of PFAS, more so than just the general public. But there's a lot of consultants that don't understand the complexities of PFAS because, frankly, it's not something you learn in a couple of days. It's very complex.
Just as an aside, and not to get sidetracked here, but are there other chemicals on your radar screen, that aren't typical, that people aren't necessarily focusing on in due diligence, then and maybe they should be?
Well, there's a whole subfield within the remediation business of emerging contaminants, and one is 1,2,3 trichloropropane. It's relatively toxic and not often considered, but it's a good example of another emerging contaminant that could cause an issue with respect to due diligence.
Where might one find that chemical?
I've seen it at chemical manufacturing facilities, for example. It's not as prevalent as PFAS, and there are no other chemicals that are as prevalent as PFAS with as low of these, well, the state cleanup standards or the EPA's health advisories or even the former health advisories. Part per trillion levels are rarely used except for extremely toxic compounds like dioxins.
Sticking with the due diligence and transactional topic, what are you seeing, or how are insurance companies and lenders reacting to these developments, which obviously affect risk?
Um, Insurance companies are very quick to include PFAS in their list of excluded pollutants. Um, Although, if there's no reason to exclude PFAS, I have seen policies that included or didn't exclude PFAS. And then with respect to lending, again, the lenders are typically use internal or external consultants to review phase ones. And what I've seen is them asking questions about PFAS, whereas as short as 2 years ago, I was not seeing those types of questions being asked.
Yeah, and there's no question that we're going to see more of that. As this becomes more and more on the radar screen, if that's even possible. John, I wanted to move on and talk about PFAS in the context of site cleanups. Um, it's an unfair question, but um, I assume there's a lot of PFAS sites that are going to be discovered out there.
There are, and what we're seeing is, some states have requirements for broad testing. New York required PFAS testing at every site except leaking petroleum underground storage tank sites. Um, and they're getting detections. Now, what they're going to do with all this data is going to be very interesting. But if you go to the Environmental Working Group map, you can see that the states with the most, the Environmental Working Group, excuse me, worked with Northeastern University to develop a map of all sites with PFAS detections. And if you were to go, you could Google Environmental Working Group PFAS map, you'll get to that site. If you go to that site and you look at what states have the most detections, it's Michigan, it's New York, it's the northeastern states, particularly Rhode Island, where a lot of PFAS testing has taken place. So what we're seeing is states are beginning to require more PFAS testing, and they're having more detections. Uh, so it's going to have a profound effect. Uh, uh, Grant Ferrier, who runs the Environmental Business Journal, has done an estimation on the number of PFAS sites, tens of thousands, and the cost to clean up the sites. And his current most recent estimate, I was with him last week, was about in the neighborhood of 85 billion with a B dollars and that's in the US only.
I mentioned at the outset of this program that we know that some industry groups are contesting the hazardous substance proposed listing, and one of the bases for challenging that rulemaking is an assertion that US EPA did not take into consideration the cost of the rule. And so that's a question that's probably going to be addressed by the courts. And exactly, sort of germane to the comment that you just made about the cost. Um, we have seen some of our clients be very frustrated because they've started remediation projects at former manufacturing properties in the 80s or early 90s and have got to the point where the site is essentially remediated, other than perhaps monitoring um, and maybe some engineering controls and things like that. And then all of a sudden, the agencies have asked for assessments of potential PFAS risks, and if there's any concerns, testing. And that is a bitter pill to swallow after 30 years or so of remediation.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. It's and it illustrates the profound impact that PFAS could have to the regulated community.
We I know we could have a whole separate podcast on remediation technologies as they are developed to try to address PFAS contamination. And with the number of sites that you just mentioned and the costs, there's going to be a lot of people focusing on developing new technologies. Can you give us a little bit of an overview of where things stand? You know, how is PFAS being remediated now, and what's kind of in the um, maybe near future to
Oh,
look forward to?
um, so with I'll cover soil and groundwater. With respect to soil, we're still seeing excavation, offsite disposal, although a number of landfills are not taking soils with high levels of PFAS. There's a landfill, I believe, in a U.S. ecology landfill in Utah that readily accepts it because of the depth of groundwater is so deep. Uh, the There's also stabilization techniques being developed. But with respect to soil, the only other treatment that I've been aware of is thermally heating the soil, and then PFAS which is generally non-volatile at ambient temperatures, can volatilize and be captured. So we had an article in the journal about that. With respect to groundwater, uh, there's basically 3 or 4 accepted technologies. The 2 are most common are related to pump and treat, where the treatment is either granular activated carbon or ion exchange resins. And with activated carbon generally being the more cost-effective method, but as the PFAS levels drop, the ion exchange may become more prevalent in use because the economics will flip. The ion exchange are more expensive, but they're better at capturing low levels of PFAS than activated carbon, which will see breakthrough. So we might see a change in that. More frequent use of carbon to more frequent use of ion exchange resin. Then there's also injectable carbon. There's 2 vendors that offer that technology. And then there's some innovative technologies with high energy to break the PFAS, carbon fluorine bond, or capturing PFAS actually, which weirdly absorbs onto bubbles, and capturing PFAS by bubbling air through water, and the PFAS adhering to the outside of the air bubbles. So there's a couple of interesting things going on, and a lot of work being done by the Department of Defense uh, under their research arm.
Yeah, they obviously have a big stake in that outcome.
Yes.
John, uh, we know that the Biden administration has a huge focus on environmental justice and ensuring that environmental rules and policies, permit decisions, and enforcement take into account the impact on disadvantaged communities. What's the interplay that you're seeing, if any, between environmental justice and PFAS? It seems like it could be a bit of a triple whammy where new sites are being discovered or reopened at the same time as these new regulatory developments, and now this heightened focus on protecting communities where at least some of these sites may be located.
It goes back to the Superfund discussion. It's well known there's more Superfund sites in disadvantaged communities than in wealthy or rural communities. So that could drive an environmental justice angle. On the other hand, a lot of PFAS sites, fire training isn't necessarily, sometimes it's urban, but a lot of times they want to do that kind of work and training away from urban areas. So we're seeing some PFAS in rural areas where environmental justice is not as big a concern. Not that there's not environmental justice issues in rural communities, don't get me wrong, but I will say in the urban areas where there's historical manufacturing, I think there could be a focus by the regulatory agencies on tackling the urban sites first for PFAS due to environmental justice issues in the Biden administration's EJ policies. So I think it's an interesting topic, Andy.
All right, John. Well, I want to thank you very much for your participation today. It's a topic that's not going away anytime soon, and we all need to stay abreast of these developments, which are really happening at a rapid pace. I'd like to give you an opportunity to have the last word. Is there anything you would like to leave us with as kind of your final words of wisdom?
Um, yes,
Doesn't have to be totally final. We'd love to have you back, but for this session at least.
well, thank you for the offer to potentially come back. I'd say as a final word is stay aware of developments. The the group that you mentioned, the PFAS experts group that I organized, we're actually picking that back up. We're continuing to. We realize that educating the technical portion of the remediation community is important because the developments are, one, very complex. The tox is complex, the fate and transport is complex, and the remediation developments are very important. And so we're going to be having additional meetings, webinars, and writing more papers uh, to help educate the remediation community.
Okay, well, thank you. This concludes this episode of Thompson Hine's Laws podcast. We look forward to continuing to provide our listeners with current and practical insight into EH&S laws and developments in the future. The podcast episodes are available at iTunes, Spotify, Google, and SoundCloud. We'll have additional new episodes in 2023, so please be on the lookout. If you have a request regarding a topic you'd like to hear addressed in a future episode, please send me an email or contact your usual contact at Thompson Hines Environmental Group, and we'll try to address it. If you'd like to learn more about Thompson Hines Environmental Group, please visit thompsonhine.com. Finally, this podcast is for informational purposes only. It provides general information and not legal advice or opinions regarding specific facts. You may not edit, modify, or redistribute this podcast without permission. Thanks for listening today. Be well, everyone, and we'll talk to you soon.